Take a moment to focus on the man slumped on the table in a dimly lit bar. Meet Charles Dawson, a 61-year-old judge with a long career of unwavering decisions and unflinching sentences. 4 years, his courtroom had been the site of harsh rulings, particularly when it came to criminal cases. But now, the very man who once handed down life-altering judgments had become the victim of his own cruel fate. Now, shift your attention to the woman seated at a nearby booth. She is no ordinary patron of the Crescent Lounge, and her visit tonight is not coincidental. Her name is Caroline Sinclair, a woman whose grief had slowly evolved into something far darker over the past 2 years. With purpose in her every movement, Caroline rises from her seat. She walks toward Dawson's table with the calm demeanor of someone on a mission. Without hesitation, she places her hand over his drink, slipping an undetectable poison into his bourbon. Her actions are fluid, methodical, and eerily silent. She leaves just as quickly, disappearing into the shadows, vanishing from the scene though she were never there. An hour passes, and the bartender, Riley Walker, approaches Dawson. He's slouched, barely conscious, his head resting against his folded arms. Riley, unaware of the deadly act that has been set in motion, casually shakes his shoulder. Dawson, disoriented and slow, lifts his glass and takes the final sip of his drink, unknowingly sealing his fate. What began as a calculated act of vengeance will soon end in cold-blooded murder. Charles Dawson will not rise from that table again, but the roots of this deadly act were planted long before that fateful night at the Crescent Lounge. 2 years earlier, in a courtroom in Riverside, the defendant was Ethan Porter, a 24-year-old man accused of armed robbery. It was a straightforward case. Porter had held up a convenience store at gunpoint, but no one was physically harmed. His defense attorney made an impassioned plea, emphasizing that the gun was unloaded and that Porter had no history of violence. Yet, despite the defense's arguments, the presiding judge, Charles Dawson, made a swift and brutal decision. He denied the request for leniency and sentenced Ethan to the maximum penalty, 12 years in a state correctional facility. Sitting in the courtroom's front row that day was Caroline Sinclair, Ethan's aunt. She had raised him since the age of 11, after the death of his parents. As the judge delivered his verdict, Caroline's emotions boiled over. She shouted, her voice echoing through the hushed courtroom. Security was quick to intervene, escorting her out before she could cause further disruption. To the court, it was just another emotional outburst, and they moved on. But for Caroline, this was not the end, it was merely the beginning. In the 2 years that followed, Caroline led a quiet life on the surface. She continued working as a medical records clerk, paid her bills without issue, and visited Ethan once a month at St. Clair Correctional Facility. To her colleagues, friends, and family, Caroline appeared as a woman who was simply coping with a tough family situation. But beneath her calm exterior, something darker was taking shape. Friends noticed her becoming increasingly withdrawn, no longer socializing like she used to. She stopped attending the church services she had once been an active participant in, and her behavior at work began to shift. She asked more questions than usual questions about courthouse operations, staff schedules, and security procedures. When asked why, she claimed she was thinking of applying for a job in the courthouse. But in reality, Caroline was carefully crafting a plan that would change everything. What nobody knew, however, was that in the privacy of her own home, Caroline's obsession with revenge had taken a chilling turn. On her computer, her internet search history painted a disturbing picture. In early 2008, her searches were blunt and chilling. How much cyanide is lethal? Where can I buy potassium cyanide? Cyanide detection time. With each click of the mouse, Caroline was plotting the judge's death, unaware that her digital trail was steadily leading investigators closer to her. Caroline was methodical. She knew Judge Dawson's routine. his favorite hangouts, and the times when he was most vulnerable. But she needed an insider to complete her plan. That's when she turned to Riley Walker, the bartender at the Crescent Lounge. Caroline approached Riley in February 2008, offering her $2,500 to slip a substance into Dawson's drink. Riley, unsure and unwilling to take such a drastic step, refused, but Caroline was persistent. 3 more times she returned, raising her offer each time until it reached $5,000. Riley ultimately agreed, but with a twist. Instead of poisoning the drink herself, she would become the lookout. Caroline, with her calm and calculating demeanor, paid her and ensured that Riley would notify her when Judge Dawson was alone and vulnerable. Caroline never believed the plan would fail. On the morning of Tuesday, March 18, 2008, the plan was set into motion. Riley sent Caroline a text, "He's here." 2 other customers left, just me and kitchen. Caroline wasted no time, arriving at the Crescent Lounge 20 minutes later. She chose a table in the corner, ordered a coffee, and waited for the right moment. Security footage captured the next 40 minutes as Dawson drank glass after glass of bourbon, each sip growing slower, more disoriented. By 10:35 a.m., he was barely able to keep his head up, slumped over in his chair. This was the moment Caroline had been waiting for. At 10:42 a.m., she rose from her seat and walked calmly to his table. The footage shows her standing there, hovering over Dawson's drink. For 30 seconds, her hand moves with precision, subtly poisoning his glass. Once the deed was done, she returned to her seat and, at 10:48 a.m., left the bar. Riley, however, remained in the background, ensuring no one noticed her involvement. For the next hour, Dawson remained slouched at the table. His body grew colder, his breathing more erratic. At 12:37 p.m., Riley approached him again, this time shaking his shoulder. But Dawson did not respond. She checked for signs of life and found none. Panicking, she dialed 911. When paramedics arrived at 12:44 p.m., they found Dawson dead at the scene. At first, it appeared to be a typical case of alcohol poisoning. However, the details did not add up. His lips and fingertips were tinged blue, a sign of cyanosis, and there was a small amount of froth around his mouth. This was not the typical outcome of a heart attack or alcohol poisoning. The investigation quickly shifted to homicide. As the police worked through the evidence, they uncovered something chilling: a high concentration of sodium cyanide in Dawson's bloodstream. The same poison was found in his bourbon glass. The investigators turned to the security footage for more answers. There, they saw Caroline approaching Dawson's table and manipulating his drink. 2 weeks later, Caroline was arrested at her home and charged with capital murder. She invoked her right to remain silent, but the circumstantial evidence against her was overwhelming. Her motive, revenge for her nephew Ethan's harsh sentence, was clear. Her internet search history, the footage from the Crescent Lounge, and the testimony of Riley Walker sealed her fate. The trial in November 2008 was a battle of narratives. The prosecution painted Caroline as a methodical and cold-blooded killer, while the defense argued that there was no physical evidence linking her directly to the cyanide. In the end, the jury was convinced by the circumstantial evidence, and Caroline Sinclair was convicted of capital murder. On January 14, 2009, she was sentenced to death. The story of Caroline Sinclair, the quiet woman who transformed into a calculated killer, sent shockwaves through the community. Her deadly obsession became a local legend, the tale of a woman whose grief had twisted into something far more sinister. To this day, investigators have never solved one key mystery: where did Caroline obtain the cyanide? The Crescent Lounge, once a popular spot for locals, closed its doors for good shortly after the murder, unable to recover from the notoriety of the crime. And as for Caroline, Her life now awaits the final verdict of the legal system, a chilling reminder that even the most seemingly ordinary lives can spiral into darkness when driven by obsession. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as the judge banged his gavel, signaling the start of the trial. Caroline Sinclair, now known to the public as the woman who had plotted the death of Judge Charles Dawson, sat quietly at the defendant's table. Her face, once calm and composed, now carried the weight of an internal battle, a fight between the grief that had driven her to this point and the cold realization that her actions would forever change the course of her life. The prosecutor, James Holloway, began by painting a chilling picture of Caroline's premeditated revenge. He stood before the jury, speaking in a steady, authoritative voice. This case is not about a moment of rash anger or a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was the calculated, deliberate act of a woman who had been planning murder for over 2 years. Holloway presented the jury with the evidence, Caroline's search history, the damning toxicology report, and, most importantly, the security footage from the Crescent Lounge. The footage, grainy yet unmistakable, showed Caroline walking toward Judge Dawson's table, her hand hovering over his drink, poisoning him without a hint of hesitation. He explained the hours of silent, strategic planning that had gone into the act, and how Caroline had worked with Riley Walker, the bartender, to ensure Dawson's fate was sealed. The story was clear. Caroline had sought out revenge, methodically, using the cyanide as her weapon. The courtroom was filled with murmurs, and many in the gallery couldn't help but be captivated by the transformation of a seemingly mild-mannered woman into a cold-blooded murderer. Caroline's once quiet life had been replaced by this ruthless pursuit of vengeance. But the prosecution's case had one glaring weakness. No one could definitively say where Caroline had obtained the cyanide. The defense attorney, Charles Branson, rose to present his case. He was a seasoned lawyer, calm and collected, and he knew that to save his client, he would have to create doubt in the minds of the jury. He began his argument with a soft, measured tone. Yes, there is no question that Caroline Sinclair had motive. Her nephew, Ethan Porter, was sentenced to 12 years in prison by Judge Dawson. But that motive, while it might explain her anger, does not prove that she killed the judge. Branson went on to argue that while the circumstantial evidence seemed to fit, the prosecution's case was built on assumptions, not hard facts. The prosecution has no physical evidence that links Caroline Sinclair to the cyanide. No one saw her buy the poison. No one saw her bring it into the Crescent Lounge. Her internet searches, while concerning, could easily be explained as the actions of a grieving aunt trying to understand the medical process behind her nephew's ordeal. As Branson continued, Caroline sat motionless, her eyes fixed ahead, betraying no emotion. It was as though she had built an emotional wall around herself, a wall that was slowly crumbling with each passing argument. There was no denying the truth anymore. The case against her was becoming undeniable. Yet, as the trial unfolded, Caroline began to wonder whether it had all been worth it. Was her nephew, Ethan, truly worth the loss of her own life? Was the revenge worth the death of a man who had merely followed the law? As she sat there, she couldn't help but think back to the moment her life had changed forever, the day Judge Dawson sentenced Ethan to the maximum penalty. The memory was still fresh in her mind, even after all this time. It was September 2006, in Riverside County. She had been there, sitting in the courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest. Ethan, a young man with no prior criminal record, was facing charges for armed robbery. Caroline had watched him grow up, had raised him like a son, but at the tragic death of his mother, he was all she had left in the world. When the judge had delivered the harsh sentence, Caroline had seen red. The words echoed in her ears, each one feeling like a personal betrayal. How could he do this to her nephew? How could he be so merciless? In that moment, she had been consumed by the desire for justice, no, for retribution. And she had promised herself that she would make Dawson pay. She would make him regret the day he ever crossed her. For 2 years, she had kept her plan in the shadows, a secret only shared with Riley Walker, the bartender who had agreed to be her accomplice. At first, Riley had hesitated, but as Caroline raised the stakes, increasing her offer, Riley had finally relented. Caroline didn't care about Riley's reluctance. All she cared about was the end result, Dawson's death. But now, as she sat in the defendant's chair, facing the consequences of her actions, the reality of what she had done began to sink in. She had crossed a line that could never be undone. Her nephew, Ethan, was still in prison, and now she would likely join him behind bars. The prosecution's case was airtight. The internet searches, the security footage, the testimonies from witnesses, it all pointed to Caroline as the mastermind behind Dawson's murder. But still, there was the lingering question of how she had obtained the cyanide. Investigators had spent months searching for an answer, and yet they had found no trace of the poison in her personal belongings. Had she obtained it from a secret source, or had someone else been involved, pulling strings behind the scenes? As the trial neared its conclusion, the pressure was mounting. Caroline's defense had done little to disprove the evidence against her, and the jury was leaning toward a guilty verdict. In the final days of the trial, a new twist emerged, one that would alter the course of the proceedings forever. A breakthrough came when investigators discovered a hidden stash of emails on Caroline's work computer. The emails were between her and a man named Thomas Lawson, a former acquaintance from her past. Lawson had been a chemist who had worked with various industries, including pharmaceuticals. The emails were brief but direct, outlining a transaction that took place months before Dawson's murder. Caroline had reached out to Lawson, asking for help in acquiring a special ingredient, something that could help with a personal project. The emails were vague, but they were enough to provide the missing link in the case. Lawson was brought in for questioning, and after hours of interrogation, he confessed to providing Caroline with the cyanide. He had known about her anger toward Dawson, and had supplied her with the poison in exchange for a substantial sum of money. Caroline had kept this part of the plan a secret, knowing that the less people knew, the better. With this new information, the prosecution's case became even stronger. The jury now had concrete evidence linking Caroline to the acquisition of the cyanide. The defense's argument, which had hinged on the lack of physical evidence, was crumbling. In the end, the jury deliberated for just 6 hours before returning with a verdict. Caroline Sinclair, the woman who had transformed from a grieving aunt to a cold-blooded murderer, was found guilty of capital murder. The room fell silent as the verdict was read aloud. On January 14, 2009, Caroline was sentenced to death. Her family, once proud of her quiet strength, now had to grapple with the reality of her actions. Ethan, still serving his sentence in prison, would never know the full extent of his aunt's obsession. He would never know how far Caroline had gone to avenge him. As Caroline was escorted from the courtroom, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, regret, fear, and disbelief. She had won her battle, but in the process, she had lost everything. Her life, her future, her family, it was all gone. And the weight of her actions would haunt her for the rest of her days.